Now point 3, acquire resources. Acquire resources is a process of obtaining team members, facilities, equipment, materials, supplies and other resources necessary to complete the project work. The key benefit of this process is that it outlines, guides the selection of resources and assigns them to their prospective activities. This process is performed periodically or throughout the project as needed. The resources needed for the project can be internal or external to the project performing organisation. Internal resources are acquired or assigned from functional or resource managers. External resources are acquired through the procurement process. The project management team may or may not have direct control over the resource selection because the collective bargaining agreements, use of subcontractor personnel, a matrix project environment, internal or external reporting relationships or other reasons. That's from PMBOK Guide, page 328. The wording in this process is a little odd. That's because in previous versions of the PMBOK Guide, this process was called Acquire Project Team. But now it has been expanded to include all resources, and it seems in some sentences they have just changed project team to project team in physical resources. But the change makes sense because there are a lot of similarities between managing both types of resources. In some ways this can be the scariest part because up to this point everything regarding resources has been on paper, but now it suddenly gets real. Until now, a mistake was a mistake on paper, but now you could damage a project or even your own career by failing at this point, so please do it carefully. The big tip for the exam is that you're working for a huge organisation managing an enormous project. Why does this matter? Because you have the time and money to include all processes. You have a department to carry out procurement following your instructions. You will have an entire legal department to draw up and chase after contracts. You will have neatly organised libraries of lessons learned. This is just like your organisation, isn't it? The PMBOK Guide was based on NASA and Department of Defence projects, and that is the size of the project you need to keep in mind each time you answer a question, unless it states very clearly otherwise. If you work in a small company managing low budget 3-month projects, never approach your PMP questions thinking, what would I do in that situation? Because once you think that, your subconscious mind is already selecting the wrong answer for you. Think big projects. It's important that the following factors are considered during the process of acquiring the project resources. And this is an example of the slightly odd wording I mentioned before. The PMBOK Guide 6th edition says, the project manager or project team should effectively negotiate and influence others who are in a position to provide the required team and physical resources for the project. Whereas going back to the PMBOK 5th edition, it said the project manager or project management team should effectively negotiate and influence others who are in a position to provide the required human resources for the project. PMP is simply changed required human resources to required team and physical resources. On a project, I don't think you'll often have to influence people to hand over physical resources, and I suspect that this sort of wording will change with the 7th edition of the PMBOK Guide. But for now, this is what it says, and that's all that matters for the exam. Failure to acquire the necessary resources for the project may affect project schedules, budgets, customer satisfaction, quality and risks. And you can add to that, and your career. This is an area you really need to get right. I'm sure you're familiar with the saying, you can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. Well, you can't make a good work package out of poor resources. Inefficient resources or capabilities decrease the probability of success, and in a worst case scenario, it could result in project cancellation. If the team resources are not available due to constraints such as economic factors or assignment to other projects, the project manager or project team may be required to assign alternate resources, perhaps with different competencies or costs. And what this means is, if all you can get are sow's ears, then you've got no choice but to try to make silk purses out of them. Alternative resources are allowed provided there is no violation of legal, regulatory, mandatory or other specific criteria. These factors should be considered and accounted for in the planning stages of the project. The project manager or project management team will be required to document the impact of the unavailability of required resources in a project schedule, project budget, project risks, project quantity, training plans and other project management plans. Acquire resources inputs. Input number 1, project management plan. Project management plan components that we are interested in for this process would include resource management plan, because naturally it provides guidance on how to acquire resources for the project. Procurement management plan, because this is information regarding resources that will be acquired from outside the project. This includes information on how procurements will be integrated with other project work and stakeholders involved in procuring resources. In the exam you will have a procurement department and you will have to interface with them. You will need to be drawing up requirements and be involved in bidders conferences and head up the selection panel, and this has somehow all got to work together. I joined a huge organisation and I was managing a project that required a number of top-level software development resources hired for 2 years. The project also needed a lot of specialised computers and a server farm and all sorts of other things. I'd worked with the team to specify all of these things. Then the project sponsor told me to procure them. I said, oh, so I've got to go to the procurement department to procure them. He said, no, they won't understand those sort of requirements. They will stuff it up, so I want you to do everything. So even in a huge organisation, they don't always do what the PMBOK guide says they should do. Cost baseline. The cost baseline provides the overall budget for the project activities. Project documents. Documents considered for this input would include the project schedule, because that shows the activities and their planned start and end dates to help determine when the resources need to be available and acquired. If you're not familiar with procurement, you can easily fall into the trap of thinking that you can actually procure things as you need them. But many resources, especially people, can have significant lead times. In the Australian Public Service, for example, from the time of identifying the need for a person to the time that person is actually sitting at a desk is typically around 6 weeks. And a slightly non-standard personal computer can take 4 weeks or longer. You need to be aware of all these lead times so that you can begin the procurement process in time. Resource calendars. I've mentioned these several times. Resource calendars document the time periods that each resource needed for the project is available for the project. Creating a reliable schedule depends on having a good understanding of each resource's availability and schedule constraints, including time zones, work hours, vacation time, local holidays, maintenance schedule and commitments to other projects. Resource calendars are progressively elaborated and updated throughout the project. Once created as an output of this process, they are used as needed whenever this process is repeated. Resource requirements. Resource requirements identify which resources are needed to be acquired. Stakeholder register. This may reveal stakeholders' needs or expectations for specific resources to be used in the project that need to be considered in the acquire resources process. On a project in the UK, I was already into the procurement process when by accident I met Albert. Albert was in charge of stores. He tended to stay inside the storerooms and I suspected he probably slept there at nights too. He was a key stakeholder of the project, but his reclusive nature led to him being overlooked. Do you remember the fairy tale Sleeping Beauty? After the baby was born and 7 good fairies were invited to the christening, each good fairy was given a golden plate to eat from. But everyone had forgotten about the fairy number 8, who lived on her own and was very reclusive. The first 6 fairies give the magical gifts to the baby, and then the 8th fairy arrived. They don't have any golden plates left, so they gave her just a china plate. The 8th fairy is furious and curses the baby that she will prick her finger on a spindle of a spinning wheel and die. But the 7th fairy hadn't used her wish yet. She isn't powerful enough to remove the curse, but she uses her wish to change it so that instead of dying, the baby will sleep for 100 years. So, back to the project. I had invited at least 7 good stakeholders. Everyone had forgotten Albert, but he found out and then turned up at the stakeholder meeting and cursed me. I pointed out that I was new to the company and I was relying on the others to identify key stakeholders, so he cursed them instead. In case you've forgotten, we were talking about stakeholder register. And now the stakeholder register may reveal stakeholders' needs or expectations for specific resources to be used in the project that need to be considered in the acquire resources process. Now, if the other stakeholders had remembered Albert and Albert had been included from the beginning, we would have known his expectations, which were that he didn't actually need to procure a lot of the project resources. The reason for this was that a previous project had been cancelled. The other stakeholders knew that the previous project had been cancelled, but they didn't realise that the resources that had been procured had not been returned. Normally they would have been returned, but the company they'd bought them from had gone bankrupt and so they couldn't be returned. If I had continued with procurement, going on the advice from these stakeholders, I would have spent a lot of money and time unnecessarily. We just had to requisition them from the stores, and this ended up saving us not only the money, but it saved us a huge amount of time because there's no lead time on them. When you create a stakeholder register, always say to yourself, did I remember Albert? Input number 3, enterprise environmental factors. The enterprise environmental factors that can influence the acquire resources process include existing information on organisational resources, including availability, competence levels and prior experience for team resources and resource costs, marketplace conditions, organisational structure and geographic locations. Input number 4, organisational process assets. And the ones we would be interested in here are policies and procedures for acquiring, allocating and assigning resources to the project, and historical information and lessons learned repository. Just a reminder here that lessons learned repository is from previous projects, lessons learned register is from the current project. Acquire resources, tools and techniques. Tool and technique number 1, decision making. A decision-making technique can be used in the acquire resources process, includes multi-criteria decision analysis. Selection criteria are often used to select physical project resources or the project team. Using a multi-criteria decision analysis tool, criteria can be developed and used to rate and score potential resources. For example, choosing between internal and external team resources. The criteria are weighted according to their relative importance and values can be changed for different types of resources. Some examples of selection criteria that can be used are availability, to verify that the resource is available to work on the project within the time period needed. Cost, verify the cost of adding the resource is within the prescribed budget. Availability, verify the team member provides the capability needed on the project. Some selection criteria that are unique for team resources are experience. Verify that the team member has a relevant experience that will contribute to the project's success. Knowledge. Consider if the team member has relevant knowledge of the customer, similar implemented projects and nuances of the project environment. Skills. Determine if the team member has the relevant skills to use a project tool. Attitude. Determine if the team member has the ability to work with others as a cohesive team. International factors. Consider team members' location, time zone and communication abilities. Tool and technique number 2, interpersonal team skills. A skill that could be used for this process includes negotiation. Many projects require negotiation for required resources. The project management team may need to negotiate with functional managers, your borrowing the line manager staff members. Try to get the best you can for as long as you can, but the functional manager will resist because they need them too. If you're not winning, try to get other managers or the project sponsor to help persuade that line manager. Other project management teams within the performing organisation. Appropriately design or share scarce or specialised resources. If you have desirable resources allocated to your team, you may be able to do some horse trading. For example, if you have the capacity, offer your specialist to solve a problem for another team, then when your project isn't too busy, then you can call in the favour later. And that's a bit like levelling resources, but across different projects with different project managers. External organisations and suppliers. These provide appropriate, scarce, specialised, qualified, certified and other specific team or physical resources. Special consideration should be given to external negotiating policies, practices, processes, guidelines, legal and other criteria. The project management team's ability to influence others plays an important role in negotiating resource allocation, so does the policies of the organisations involved. The PMBOK guide suggests convincing a functional manager about the high visibility of the project may influence him or her to assign the best resources to this project over competing ones. I think what that really means is tell the functional manager that this is a high-profile project. If it fails, you will tell the CEO about functional managers who could have helped but didn't. Tool and technique number 3, pre-assignment. When physical or team resources for a project are determined in advance, they are considered pre-assigned. This situation can occur if the project is a result of specific resources being identified as part of a competitive proposal, or if the project is dependent upon the expertise of particular resources, a particular expert for example. Pre-assignment might also include the team members who have already been assigned and developed project charter process or other processes before the initial project management plan has been completed. Tools and techniques number 4, virtual teams. A few years ago I was running a project for a bank in Manila. Half of my programmers were in Perth, Western Australia and the rest in Bangkok. My business analysts were in Manila, Hong Kong and London. Without communications technology, this project would not have been possible. With all of the cities involved except for London, we were in similar time zones. I remember once or twice phoning Bob. He was my business analyst in London, and a sleepy woman's voice would appear at the other end of the phone. "Bob, wake up Bob, it's Australia." And then I would remember it's the middle of the night in London. This was what you call a virtual team. Virtual teams don't have to be international. They could be in the same state or same city. In fact, they could even be in the same large building or university campus. The cost of this type of communication, especially video communication, used to be absolutely prohibitive. But now all you need is a computer or even a smartphone and you can chat with people all over the world for a low cost. And this opens doors to small companies, especially in information technology or consultancy and so on, because they can manage projects in places in the world that would otherwise be totally out of reach for them in terms of travel time and cost. The virtual team model makes it possible to form teams of people from the same organisation who live in widespread geographical areas. Add additional expertise to a project team even though the expert is not in the same geographical area. Incorporate employees who work from home offices. Form teams of people who work different shifts, hours or days, including people with mobility limitations or disabilities. Move forward with projects that would have been held or cancelled due to the travel expenses and save the expense of offices and all physical equipment needed for employees. Communication planning becomes increasingly important in a virtual team environment. Additional time may be needed to set clear expectations, facilitate communication, develop protocols for resolving conflict, include people in decision making, understand cultural differences and share credit in successes. Acquire resources outputs. Output number 1, physical resource requirements. This records the material, equipment, supplies, locations and other physical resources that will be used during the project. Outputs number 2, project team assignments. This records the team members and their roles and responsibilities for the project. Documentation can include a project team directory and names inserted into the project management plan such as project organisation, charts and schedule. Output number 3, resource calendars. A resource calendar identifies the working days, shifts, start and end of normal business hours, weekends, public holidays and when each specific resource is available or unavailable. Information on such resources, such as team resource, equipment and material, are potentially available during a planned activity period is used for estimating resource utilisation. Resource calendars also specify when and for how long identified team and resources will be available during the project. This information may be at the activity or project level. This includes consideration of attributes such as resource experience and/or skill level, as well as various geographical locations. Output number 4, change requests. When changes occur as a result of carrying out the acquire resources process, for example impacts to the schedule, or when recommended corrective or preventative actions impact any of the components of the project management plan or project documents, the project manager needs to submit a change request. Change requests are processed for review and action through the Perform Integrated Change Control System. Output number 5, project management plan updates. Any change to project management plan goes through the organisation's change control process via a change request as just mentioned. Components of the project management plan that may be updated as a result of carrying this process would include the resource management plan, because that needs to be updated to reflect actual experience in acquiring resources for the project, including lessons learned in acquiring resources early in the project that will impact how resources are acquired later in the project. Cost baseline, because it may change as a result of acquisition of resources for the project. Output number 6, project document updates. The documents that may be updated as a result of this process are the lessons learned register. This is updated with information on challenges encountered and how they could have been avoided, as well as approaches that worked well for acquiring resources. Changes to the project schedule may result from availability of required resources. The resource breakdown structure. The resources required during the process are recorded in the resource breakdown structure. Resource requirements. Resources requirements documentation is updated to reflect resources acquired for the project. The risk register, new risks identified during this process are recorded in the risk register and managed using the risk management process. Stakeholder register. The stakeholder register is updated with any new stakeholders and any new information about existing stakeholders that has been gained as a result of this process. Output number 7, enterprise environmental factor updates. The updates for the environmental process factors include resource availability within the organisation and amount of the organisation's consumable resources that have been used. Output number 8, organisational process asset updates. The assets that need to be updated would be the acquire resource process documentation relating to acquiring, assigning and allocating resources. That brings us to the end of the acquire resources. The next lesson is 9.4, develop team. Please read the corresponding chapter in the PMBOK guide before watching the video.